Hi, my name is Gina Wagers, and this is going to be a brief training on culturally responsive and accessible assessments that we use in USD 475. This training connects with our strategic plan goals, three of them specifically in supporting academic learning, also addressing social and emotional needs of students, and then creating opportunities to enhance family and community engagement. Our learning objectives and targets for today, we want to learn how to use research to evaluate the quality of assessments and the importance of implementing assessments that are culturally responsive and accessible. We're learning this so that we can build our capacity to analyze and use assessment data to improve our instruction. And we're going to know that we've learned these things because we're going to be able to describe the assessment types, explain the types of assessments that are used within our building and district to stakeholders, and then we're going to develop some strategies for being able to interpret assessment data so that we can engage in meaningful collaboration to improve our student outcomes. So to start with a broad overview, there's different types of assessments or categories that assessments can fall under. One of the broader categories that we look at when we're looking at assessments is whether they're formative or summative. Formative assessments are more low stakes and a lot more informal. When we think of formative assessments, a lot of these happen at a classroom level in day-to-day instruction because they're really aimed at monitoring student learning during the learning process. And formative assessments really hinge on you being able to give immediate feedback to students based on their learning. Within our district, some examples of curriculums we have that have examples of formative assessment where you can do quick checks, quick writes, quizzes that are not necessarily entered in the grade book, or assessments where you're kind of informally measuring student understanding, like as you're nearing the ends of units would be our Study Sync curriculum or our TCI curriculum. Summative assessments are more formal and cumulative. When you think about summative assessments, this is evaluating learning at the end of a specific period of instruction because you're wanting to determine readiness or mastery or assign a grade. A lot of times summative assessments are built into our curriculums or are agreed upon. We use specific assessments to measure certain skills at the end of units kind of universally throughout the district based on what is in the curriculums like Study Sync and TCI. Summative assessments are also considered what we would use as our more standardized tests to not only measure individual students within classrooms or buildings or within our district, but to compare them statewide, which is our KITE platform, which our CAP testing takes place on. And so we use that information as well because that is aimed at measuring skills within those specific content areas. When we think about assessments too, we think about the purpose of those different assessments, not just in being able to inform daily instruction or measure growth in specific content areas from grade level to grade level, but we also use universal screeners across the district. Our platform for doing that is FastBridge. We use the auto reading and A reading, and then we use CBM math and then math automaticity. Within that, that's given 3 times a year, beginning, middle, and end. That's to evaluate the efficiency of our core instructional programming and really to help identify students who are not meeting benchmarks or those expectations on that academic side. We also utilize SABRE screener within our district, which is more of a social, emotional, and behavioral screener to measure the level of at-riskness that students have with their social, emotional, or behavioral skills. We do not have students use the self-assessment because of the House bill that limits how we how we survey or collect information from students, but that is a classroom teacher-based perception assessment where you're measuring those specific things. Diagnostics kind of help drill down and give some more specific information based on what kind of risk level the universal screeners indicate. So for us in our district, the universal screener is used kind of to help place kids in MTSS tiers so that we can identify who might need some additional data or information about. And that's where we use iReady or Language Live within that MTSS structure as diagnostic tools, because those are given before and after periods of learning, and they're more specific to assess students' current knowledge base. These are really neat in the sense that they are adaptive tests that are done on the computer. So they really pinpoint specific gaps in student learning And then over time, also within those curriculums, once students are placed in MTSS, have the ability to track their growth, whether they're stagnant, regressing, or filling in some of those gaps. And then really when we look at our instructional coaches and our teams that meet within buildings, that diagnostic data then feeds back into what we look at when we look at our screeners, because then over time, if we're filling those gaps and students are receiving those services in reading and math, if those are the areas that they're low in, we should then see that improvement in their universal screener. So we use that to kind of inform and assess our curriculum and instruction with our at-risk students. Within assessments, there's different types that you can use within the classroom level. When we look at performance-based assessment, you're thinking about requiring students to demonstrate some kind of skill or use something that they have learned in a practical or real-world way. The key to using performance-based assessments is to clearly define what the task that you're wanting students to complete is, and thinking about what the success criteria or how you're going to be assessing them, whether that's a rubric or some kind of checklist that you give them up front so they know exactly what product they need to put forth in order to show their mastery of that knowledge or those skills. Performance-based assessment is nice because it's more about the process of them developing that project or doing that real world task, so that they're receiving that feedback throughout the process, and that ultimately by the time they're done with that experience or that performance-based task, that they have then mastered or showed mastery of those skills. Standards-based assessment is something that we use in our district at the elementary level, and that's how grades are reported on progress reports and report cards to parents and families. At our secondary level, we have been making some progress in moving more towards using standards-based assessments, but standards-based assessments are measuring student performance relative to a specific learning standard, which would be then tied into like state guidelines within your specific curriculums as well. So these can be, standards-based assessment can take place both through formative and summative assessments using that framework. And again, it's really just about that mastery of learning objectives to show specific skill mastery. When you're looking at any type of assessment, it's important to know what type of data that assessment is going to be providing you, because based on whatever you're going to be using it for, whether it's to inform your instruction, to evaluate how your curriculum is doing, or to track a specific student's progress, you want to know what kind of information you're going to be getting so that you can determine whether or not it's going to be valid and support the decisions that you're going to be making based on that information. So when we talk about the type of data you're looking at, we have criterion-based and then we have norm-based. Criterion-based is more about looking at how you're measuring students relative to a predetermined criteria or specific curriculum, whether that's the standards or the specific skills. Norm-based is a little bit more broad and generalized because it's not necessarily measured to that specific skill, but you're measuring the students relative to their group of peers, whether that's grade level peers, age group peers, or within a building. So it doesn't give as specific of a snapshot of a student, it's more relative, but it does kind of give you some guidance as far as looking at groups of students together, because then you can kind of measure groups against one another. And if you notice this one fifth grade class in the one fifth grade hallway is doing significantly better on a specific assessment than another one, then maybe that's a point that needs to be delved into a little bit further. So it can be helpful, but it's important to notice that, again, it only guides instructional performance. You also need direct instruction that's linked to assessment to address why the scores might be looking that way. So the key takeaway here is taking multiple points of data from multiple types of assessments to really get a full picture of student performance. Within types of assessments that you might be using in your classroom, you can use self-assessment, which requires students to evaluate their own progress or skills, whether that's with a rubric or a checklist. It's a really great way to reinforce learning objectives and also cultivate some of those deeper skills with goal setting and critical thinking to help them kind of own that learning process and understand, what they might need to work on so that they can be better advocates for their needs. Peer assessment's another strategy for assessing, where students are evaluating and giving constructive feedback to one another throughout a process of learning, maybe as they're doing some kind of cumulative project or group work where you're wanting them to kind of help evaluate and determine progress within a group. So all of that information about different types of assessments and the data that they provide is really important, because we have to choose the right assessments based on what it is that we need to look at or adjust, because we can't make good decisions without that. So if we're not clear about the purpose of an assessment that we're giving students as we're designing it or we're implementing it, then we're in danger of using that assessment in a way that's not really going to serve any one single purpose. So some questions to consider as you're thinking about the assessments that you're using: obviously considering the purpose. What is it that you want to get out of, what kind of information are you wanting to get out of students from them taking that assessment? Is it aligned with specific learning objectives? And what is it that you're going to be tracking or using that information for? You want to diversify your assessment methods, again, because you want a more comprehensive view of a student, more holistic view of a student. You don't want one piece of narrow information that's going to guide you to make an instructional decision that's really not what the students need. It was just a misinterpretation of that data. So you also need to ensure that your assessments are unbiased and they're inclusive. Choosing the right assessments is also important, because as you think about making sure your assessments are unbiased and they're accessible to everyone, you want to examine your own background and biases that you have, because if you're making a classroom level assessment and you have cultural references in there that might hinder or skew the scores that you're going to get, because certain groups of students are not going to understand that or have access to that information, it's really important to know the variance that you're going to have as far as what you give students and how they engage with that assessment. It also means that we have to make a bigger commitment here to digging deeper into data and examining the different outcomes for populations and really exploring why we might be seeing different pockets of students performing differently on the same assessments. So again, some guiding questions to think about as you engage with that. It's important to develop our skills to use assessment data, and there's a cycle of questioning that you can use to kind of help guide that, because assessment is a cycle of constantly getting feedback and information, using that data, analyzing it, and then using it to make decisions and inform instruction and curriculum. So teaching probes the student understanding by creating those opportunities for them to demonstrate their thinking. Then you diagnose their understanding by analyzing their responses. And I think this is a really key part at a classroom level when you're thinking about assessing and analyzing student responses. You can really encourage that metacognition by asking them, how do they know? Have them explain their thinking, because that will give you a better analysis of their response so that you can understand and pinpoint exactly where in that assessment they may have misunderstood. And then you respond to their level of understanding. We're not focusing on correcting the student error, but we want to lead the students to the desired understanding so that they are able to correct their own errors in thinking. And so again, that cycle continues and repeats. Where are you now? Where are you going? And how are you going to get there? Improving the use of our data is important, because we have software that's capable of presenting data to us, and especially bringing multiple points of data together so that we can really have more meaningful conversations and evaluate our practices and our curriculum better. Within our district, we have Power BI, which can give you specific drill down information on a student or a whole population within a building. But it's a really good platform for helping us achieve and have some of those conversations. And then that leads us to collaborating with our PLCs, tracking that progress, giving us those fresh perspectives, and allowing us to bring those multiple data points and perspectives together so that we're putting the student at the forefront and looking at a more holistic view of why the data is saying what it says about student learning. And then it also helps us with that curriculum evaluation and development. It's that continuous process where we're responding to changes in the classroom, technology, and student evaluations. We're assessing student performance and the goals of the curriculum, but then we're also assessing those tools that we're using to instruct students and how we're performing in creating those assessments and using those tools. So using assessment data improves teaching and learning by guiding our daily instruction. It informs our school initiatives. It supports our scheduling and staffing decisions. It also helps us make decisions about graduation. It informs students being placed within MTSS and individualized resources that we might purchase or provide students in response to certain data. It also helps give us insight into certain gaps within instruction and whether we need to purchase or reevaluate resources for certain subgroups. But then it also kind of helps us reset and plan professionally areas we might need to develop based on that data.